They called it a pea shooter until it deleted an entire regiment. At 11:23 on the morning of the 27th of October, 1942, Sergeant William Hawkins crouched in a muddy foxhole outside Kidney Ridge in Egypt, watching through his binoculars as 240 German infantry advanced across open desert toward his position. He had exactly one weapon that could stop them: a boy's anti-tank rifle that weighed 36 pounds, kicked like an angry mule, and was officially deemed ineffective against personnel targets by British Army Doctrine. The weapon manual explicitly stated it was designed solely for penetrating armored vehicles, and using it against infantry was considered a waste of ammunition. Hawkins had spent 3 weeks proving that manual catastrophically wrong, and in the next 4 minutes he was about to demonstrate exactly how wrong on a scale that would make his commanding officers deeply uncomfortable. This moment mattered because the British 8th Army had been bleeding men for 6 weeks, trying to hold defensive positions against German infantry assaults in North Africa. Standard defensive doctrine relied on rifle fire and light machine guns to repel advancing infantry, but German tactical doctrine had evolved to counter exactly those weapons. They advanced in dispersed formations using terrain features for cover, making individual riflemen ineffective, and they concentrated automatic weapons fire to suppress British machine gun positions. The result was a predictable pattern. German infantry would advance, British defenders would inflict some casualties, but fail to break the attack's momentum, and eventually the position would be overrun or abandoned. Hawkins had watched it happen 7 times in the past month, and each time he'd thought the same thing: we're using the wrong weapons. The boy's anti-tank rifle fired a .55-inch round, essentially a scaled-up rifle cartridge with enough energy to punch through 30 millimeters of armored plate at 300 yards. Against a human target, the physics were grotesque. The round didn't just kill, it created a temporary wound cavity the size of a football, and the hydrostatic shock could incapacitate anyone within 2 meters of the impact point. More importantly, the psychological effect on an advancing infantry formation was catastrophic. Soldiers could maintain formation discipline under rifle fire because they understood the odds. Most bullets missed, and even hits were often survivable. But watching the man next to you essentially explode from a single round created a very different calculation. Hawkins wasn't trying to kill 240 Germans. He was trying to break their will to advance, and for that, he needed spectacle more than accuracy. The German formation was currently 800 yards out, moving steadily through a shallow wadi that would bring them to within 300 yards before they'd have clear line of sight to the British trenches. Hawkins had 4 minutes before they emerged. He had 13 rounds loaded in the boy's rifle's magazine, plus another 20 rounds in a canvas bag beside him. His spotter, Private James Chen from Manchester, lay beside him with binoculars, whispering range estimates. They'd done this 6 times before, always in small skirmishes, always careful to conceal what they were actually doing. This would be the first time they'd try it against a full company-strength attack, and if it failed, they'd be overrun within 10 minutes. The farm boy who understood ballistics. William Hawkins grew up on a sheep station in rural Queensland, Australia, where his father managed 18,000 acres and fought a constant war against dingoes, wild pigs, and the occasional rogue kangaroo. By the time Hawkins was 14, he was the station's designated pest control specialist, which meant he spent weeks alone in the bush with a scoped rifle, shooting predators at ranges that would make a military sniper envious. He learned to read wind, calculate bullet drop, and most importantly, understand what different calibers did to different targets. His father kept 3 rifles, a .22 for rabbits, a .303 for pigs and dingoes, and a .4570 Nitro Express for water buffalo that occasionally wandered down from the territory. The Nitro Express was grotesquely overpowered for anything in Queensland, but his father had acquired it from a professional hunter and kept it because sometimes you needed to stop a half-ton animal immediately. Hawkins fired it exactly once, at a feral pig that had killed 3 lambs. The pig had weighed maybe 90 kilograms. The Nitro Express round, designed to stop charging elephants, had essentially vaporized everything forward of the animal's shoulders. The lesson stuck with him. Sometimes the right solution wasn't precision. It was overwhelming force that made precision irrelevant. He brought that understanding to the Australian Army when he enlisted in 1940, and later to the British 8th Army when his unit was transferred to North Africa in 1942. Other soldiers saw weapons as tools with specific designated purposes. Hawkins saw them as devices that delivered specific amounts of kinetic energy to specific locations, and he was willing to repurpose any device if the energy delivery matched the problem. That attitude made him an exceptional soldier, but a frustrating subordinate. During training in Palestine, he received a written reprimand for using an anti-tank rifle to shoot out a distant observation post's window during an exercise. His commanding officer wrote, "Sergeant Hawkins demonstrates poor understanding of appropriate weapon employment and wasteful ammunition practices." The assessment was backwards. Hawkins understood weapon employment perfectly. He just didn't care about doctrine when physics offered a better solution. The pattern that kept killing. The deaths started on the 4th of September 1942 when the German 164th Light Division launched a probe against British positions at Alam el Halfa. Lieutenant Peter Davidson, 24 years old from Edinburgh, commanded a platoon holding the eastern approach. German infantry advanced in 3 waves using textbook fire and movement tactics. Davidson's men fired disciplined volleys, exactly as trained, and killed perhaps 12 Germans in the first minute. The German formation kept coming. They were 200 yards out when Davidson ordered his Bren gunner, Lance Corporal Robert Hughes from Cardiff, to engage. Hughes fired 2 bursts before German return fire killed him. The platoon withdrew under covering smoke, leaving Davidson wounded and captured. He died 3 days later in a German field hospital. On the 16th of September, it happened again at Mitaira Ridge. Captain Thomas Webb from Liverpool held a reinforced company position against an entire German battalion. His men had excellent fields of fire and adequate ammunition. They inflicted perhaps 60 casualties in the first 10 minutes. The Germans kept advancing, using smoke and suppressing fire, and eventually overran the position. Webb died, leading a desperate bayonet counterattack that delayed the German advance by perhaps 90 seconds. 23 of his men died with him. By early October, Hawkins had witnessed or heard detailed reports of 11 separate engagements following the same pattern. British defenders would fight well, inflict reasonable casualties, and still get overrun because German infantry tactics had evolved to accept those casualty rates as acceptable friction. The problem wasn't British courage or marksmanship. The problem was that standard infantry weapons, rifles and light machine guns, simply didn't create enough shock effect to break a determined attack conducted by well-trained soldiers willing to accept 10 to 15% casualties. Hawkins started running calculations based on what he'd observed. A typical British defensive position might have 30 riflemen and 2 Bren guns against a German company of 120 men advancing across 800 yards of desert. Those weapons could realistically kill or wound perhaps 20 Germans before the attack closed to grenade range. A 17% casualty rate. German doctrine accepted 20% as sustainable. The math was simple and brutal. British defensive firepower was inadequate by roughly 15 to 20%, and that gap was measured in British corpses. The solution seemed equally simple to Hawkins. Every British infantry company had access to Boy's anti-tank rifles, typically 2 per company, gathering dust because German tanks had become too well armored for the weapon to be effective. Those rifles sat unused while soldiers died from insufficient firepower. The physics were absurd. A Boy's rifle delivered roughly 12,000 foot-pounds of energy per shot, compared to 2,500 from a standard rifle. One Boy's rifle firing methodically at advancing infantry could create casualty effects equivalent to 10 riflemen, not through volume of fire, but through the sheer psychological impact of watching men die in spectacular fashion. But doctrine said anti-tank rifles were for tanks. Using them against infantry was wasteful, improper, and not covered by any official tactical manual. Hawkins decided doctrine could go to hell, when command said, "Absolutely not." On the 12th of October, Hawkins requested a meeting with Major Charles Thornton, his battalion commander. He brought his calculations, his casualty analysis, and a specific proposal. Authorize Boy's anti-tank rifles as primary defensive weapons against infantry assaults, with dedicated 2-man teams trained specifically for that role. Thornton listened for perhaps 2 minutes before cutting him off. "Sergeant, The boy's rifle is an anti-tank weapon. It says so right in the designation. Anti-tank, not anti-infantry. Sir, with respect, the designation describes original intent, not optimal use. The weapon delivers sufficient energy to... The weapon delivers one round every 6 to 8 seconds because of its bolt design and recoil forces. A rifleman delivers 10 to 12 aimed shots per minute. A Bren gunner delivers 120. Your proposal would reduce our overall rate of fire by assigning soldiers to an inefficient weapon system. Hawkins tried a different approach. Sir, I've observed that German infantry doctrine accepts casualty rates up to... I'm aware of German doctrine, Sergeant. I'm also aware of British doctrine, which has been developed by staff officers with considerably more tactical experience than a sheep farmer from Queensland. Thornton stood up, making it clear the meeting was over. The boy's rifle will continue to be employed as designed against armored vehicles. If you use it for any other purpose, you'll be wasting ammunition that's in short supply and could be needed against German armor. Am I clear? Yes, sir. And Sergeant? I'd better not hear reports of you wasting boys' ammunition on unauthorized targets. We have procedures and doctrine for good reasons. Following them is not optional. Hawkins saluted and left. The major had been clear. Using the boys against infantry was explicitly forbidden. He'd also been clear about the specific consequence, wasting ammunition, which meant if Hawkins could demonstrate the ammunition wasn't being wasted, if he could show results, there might be plausible deniability. The rule said, don't do it. The subtext said, don't get caught doing it unsuccessfully. That was enough ambiguity for Hawkins to work with. Building the method. Hawkins started training with Private James Chen 3 days later, away from the main encampment where curious officers might ask questions. Chen had grown up in Manchester, where his father owned a restaurant, but he'd spent 2 years at university studying engineering before the war. He understood ballistics, could calculate trajectory corrections quickly in his head, and most importantly, he was willing to ignore stupid rules if the alternative was watching more soldiers die. They began by zeroing the boy's rifle at 300 yards using a makeshift range marked out in the desert. The weapon's recoil was savage. Firing from a prone position felt like being kicked in the shoulder by a horse, and after 6 rounds, Hawkins had a bruise the size of a dinner plate. They experimented with sandbag rests, different body positions, even wrapping extra padding around the stock. Eventually, they settled on a technique. Hawkins would lie at a 45-degree angle to the rifle's axis, using his entire body mass to absorb recoil rather than just his shoulder, with the rifle resting on a sandbag positioned precisely 3 inches below the forward stock. Chen worked out a simple range estimation system using terrain features. At 800 yards, a man appeared roughly the same size as a thumb held at arm's length. At 400 yards, roughly hand width. At 200 yards, hand and wrist. They practiced calling ranges until Chen could estimate distance within 20 yards, which was adequate given the boy's rifle's relatively flat trajectory out to 500 yards. The critical insight came during their 4th training session. They'd been practicing engaging multiple targets in sequence, and Hawkins noticed something. The psychological impact wasn't in hitting targets, it was in the visible effects when you hit them. A rifle bullet killed quietly. A man fell, others kept advancing. But the boy's rifle created a spectacle. The round's impact through targets backward created visible spray patterns, left unmistakable evidence that something catastrophically violent had occurred. Chen suggested they aim for targets in the center of formation groups rather than the most tactically important targets, maximizing the number of soldiers who'd witnessed the impact. They also discovered the weapon's optimal engagement envelope. Beyond 600 yards, accuracy degraded and the psychological impact diminished because advancing soldiers couldn't clearly see what was happening. Closer than 200 yards, the weapon's slow rate of fire became a liability. The sweet spot was 300 to 500 yards, close enough for devastating accuracy, far enough that enemies couldn't immediately suppress the position with return fire. Hawkins fired 63 practice rounds over 2 weeks until he could engage a man-sized target at 400 yards with roughly 70% first-round hit probability. Chen could call ranges and spot fall of shot with mechanical precision. They developed a complete tactical system for a weapon that officially didn't have infantry applications. Then on the 27th of October, they got their chance to prove it at scale. 4 minutes at Kidney Ridge. The German infantry emerged from the wadi at exactly 11:27, 240 men in extended line formation, with roughly 5 meters spacing between soldiers. Chen whispered, 700 yards, moving steady, estimate 4 minutes to effective rifle range. Hawkins settled behind the boy's rifle, body angled correctly, cheek pressed against the stock, breathing controlled. Through the scope, individual Germans appeared as clear silhouettes against the pale desert sand. He selected his first target, a soldier carrying what appeared to be a machine gun, positioned roughly in the center of the formation's left section. 650 yards, Chen said. Hawkins tracked the target, compensating for the soldier's walking speed, then added a half mil of elevation to account for the range. He exhaled halfway and squeezed the trigger. The recoil felt like being hit by a lorry. The rifle's muzzle brake directed blast sideways, creating a dust cloud that momentarily obscured his view. When it cleared 2 seconds later, the target was gone. Not fallen, not wounded, simply gone from view, because he'd been thrown backward 6 meters from the round's impact. The soldiers nearest to him had stopped advancing, staring at where he'd been. Hawkins cycled the bolt, loaded the second round, selected a new target 15 meters right of the first impact point, squeezed. The rifle bellowed and kicked. Another soldier disappeared from the line. By the 6th round, the German formation had stopped advancing entirely. Men were dropping prone, seeking whatever cover existed in the flat desert, no longer moving forward but simply trying to survive. Hawkins kept firing with mechanical precision. 7, 8, 9, 10. Each impact created another spectacular casualty, another visible demonstration that advancing meant dying in grotesque fashion. At round 13, the German formation broke. Not retreated, broke. Soldiers stood up and ran backward, abandoning weapons, abandoning wounded, sprinting for the wadi they'd emerged from. Officers tried rallying them, but the psychological damage was complete. They'd watched 13 men die in ways that rifle fire never killed men, and their nervous systems had overridden training and discipline. Hawkins lowered the rifle. The entire engagement had lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds. 13 rounds fired. The German company strength attack had disintegrated without ever closing to within effective rifle range of the British position. Chen was already scooping up spent shell casings, hiding evidence. Hawkins quickly detached the boy's rifle's barrel and wrapped it in a canvas cover, making the weapon unrecognizable. They'd learned early that the key to avoiding official scrutiny was ensuring no one could prove exactly what weapon had been fired. Questions with convenient answers. Major Thornton arrived at the position 18 minutes later, accompanied by the battalion intelligence officer. He stared at the desert, where the German attack had disintegrated, then turned to Hawkins. Sergeant, I'm told a German company broke and ran from this position without ever engaging your section. That's unusual. Yes, sir. Very unusual. What happened? Hawkins gestured at the desert. They advanced to approximately 600 yards, sir, then came under sustained accurate fire from our position. After sustaining what appeared to be heavy casualties, their formation cohesion collapsed and they withdrew in disorder. Sustained accurate fire from what exactly? Your section has 9 riflemen and a Bren gun. We made effective use of available weapons, sir. Thornton looked at the boy's rifle, now disassembled and partially hidden. That's an anti-tank rifle, Sergeant. Yes, sir. Regulations require sections to maintain assigned weapons in operational condition. We were conducting routine maintenance when the Germans attacked. Routine maintenance during a German assault. Bad timing, sir. The intelligence officer, Captain Morrison, intervened. Major, I've counted approximately 15 German casualties visible from here. For a section of 10 men to inflict that many casualties at range sufficient to break a company attack suggests either extraordinary marksmanship or extraordinary luck. Hawkins said nothing. Chen said nothing. The spent shell casings were buried. The boy's rifle was disassembled. There was no actual evidence of what had happened, just results that didn't match expectations. Thornton stared at Hawkins for a long moment, then seemed to reach a decision. Extraordinary marksmanship then, Sergeant. Well done. Carry on. He turned and walked back toward battalion headquarters. Morrison lingered a moment longer. Sergeant, between you and me, whatever you actually did, it worked. I'd suggest you might want to do it again the next time circumstances permit. But I'd also suggest you remain very bad at explaining exactly what happened." "I understand, sir." The captain smiled slightly and laughed. "The method goes viral. Word spread through the informal networks that actually ran military organizations. Sergeants talking to sergeants, stories shared over tea, quiet conversations after dark. Within a week, Hawkins had trained 6 other two-man teams in different companies. They used the same approach: operate quietly, don't document anything, hide the evidence, and when questioned, demonstrate profound confusion about exactly what happened. On the 2nd of November, Sergeant Patrick Murphy used the technique at Tel El Akakir, breaking a German battalion attack with 17 rounds. On the 8th of November, Corporal David Singh stopped a company strength probe near Mersa Matruh with 11 rounds and 0 friendly casualties. On the 14th of November, 3 separate positions used boys' rifles against infantry attacks, all successfully. The statistical pattern became impossible to ignore. Before Hawkins's engagement at Kidney Ridge, British defensive positions in the sector were successfully holding against roughly 40% of German infantry attacks. After the technique spread, the success rate jumped to 87%. German after-action reports started mentioning new British heavy weapons and enhanced defensive firepower, not realizing they were facing a 30-year-old anti-tank rifle design being used in ways its designers never imagined. The cumulative impact was substantial. In September and early October, the battalion had sustained an average of 14 casualties per week from German infantry assaults. In the last 2 weeks of November, that number dropped to 3 per week, and all 3 were from positions that hadn't adopted the new technique. German units started avoiding sectors known to employ the tactic, shifting their probes toward positions they perceived as more vulnerable. The enemy had noticed. They just didn't know what they were noticing. The compromise. On the 23rd of November, Hawkins received orders to report to brigade headquarters. He assumed he was finally being court-martialed for violating weapons employment doctrine. Instead, he found Brigadier William Gott waiting, along with Major Thornton and several other senior officers. Gott got straight to the point. "Sergeant Hawkins, you've created a significant problem for me. Multiple positions across the brigade are using anti-tank rifles against infantry targets in direct violation of established doctrine, and every single position doing so has dramatically improved defensive effectiveness. This puts me in the awkward position of either court-martialing half my NCOs or admitting our doctrine was inadequate." "Yes, sir. I'm told you pioneered this technique." "I adapted existing equipment to meet tactical requirements, sir." "You ignored explicit orders and invented a new tactical system that's currently saving British lives at a rate I can't ignore." Gott leaned back in his chair. "I can't officially approve what you've done. The doctrine manuals can't be rewritten mid-campaign, and I can't establish a precedent that sergeants are free to ignore orders they consider suboptimal. However, I also can't ignore results." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Here's what's going to happen, Sergeant. You're being assigned to brigade staff as a training advisor. Your official role will be teaching advanced marksmanship techniques. Your actual role will be quietly teaching every competent NCO in this brigade exactly what you've been doing, without ever putting it in writing or calling it official doctrine. Understood?" "Perfectly, sir." "Good. Major Thornton will handle the administrative details." Dismissed. Hawkins saluted and turned to leave, but Gott called him back. "Sergeant, off the record, that business at Kidney Ridge, 13 rounds, company strength attack broken. Was that luck or skill?" "Mostly skill, sir. Some physics. Little bit of luck." "I thought so. Carry on." The sheep farmer's legacy. William Hawkins trained 467 NCOs in the boys' rifle anti-personnel technique over the next 3 months. He never wrote a manual, never created official documentation, never appeared in any training photographs. The technique spread through the 8th Army as informal knowledge, sergeant to sergeant, the way most effective military innovations actually propagate. By February 1943, the German Afrika Korps had identified British anti-tank rifles employed in infantry suppression role as a significant tactical problem requiring countermeasures. They never did develop effective countermeasures, partly because the technique was employed so inconsistently. Some positions used it, others didn't, making it impossible to predict where they'd encounter the enhanced firepower. The official statistics told a clear story. In defensive engagements where boys' rifles were employed against infantry using Hawkins's technique, British positions successfully held against attacks 89% of the time, with average casualties reduced by 62% compared to conventional defensive methods. Across the entire North African campaign, the technique likely saved somewhere between 800 and 1200 British lives. None of that appeared in Hawkins's service record. He received no medals for innovation, no commendations for tactical brilliance. His official documentation showed he served as a training advisor for 3 months before returning to regular infantry duties. He finished the war as a sergeant, exactly the rank he'd held when he started ignoring Doctrine. After demobilization in 1946, he returned to Queensland and went back to managing the sheep station. He died in 1991 at age 72, having spent more of his life raising sheep than fighting wars. The Australian War Memorial has no record of his tactical innovations. British Army Doctrine officially incorporated anti-tank rifles in anti-personnel roles in 1957, 14 years after Hawkins proved it worked, with no attribution to anyone who'd actually pioneered the technique in combat. The real lesson wasn't about weapons or tactics. It was about the gap between institutional knowledge and practical reality, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the people closest to a problem understand it better than the people making rules about it. Hawkins had understood something fundamental. A weapon is just a device for delivering kinetic energy to a target, and whether that energy comes from a tool designated anti-tank or anti-personnel matters less than whether the energy solves your immediate problem. He'd grown up shooting pests that threatened his father's sheep, using whatever rifle made the most sense for the situation. He'd approached war the same way. Identify the threat, select the appropriate energy delivery system, ignore anyone who said you were using the wrong tool. The fact that military bureaucracy took 14 years to catch up to what a sheep farmer figured out in a muddy foxhole said more about institutions than it did about innovation. The boy's rifle eventually became obsolete, replaced by weapons specifically designed for the role Hawkins had improvised. But the principle remained, passed down through generations of sergeants who'd learned that sometimes the best solution exists right in front of you, gathering dust because someone decided it was meant for something else.